Sweet potato casserole slid through Adana's braids as her 4-year-old son screamed across the table. The mistress who poured it stood behind her husband, hand on his shoulder, smiling. When her daughter reached for a towel, he snatched it away. Adana didn't move, because the recording already playing in her purse was about to make every person at that table choose a side, out loud. What happened next at that table changed every person sitting at it. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why some women don't need to raise their voice to burn a house down. There were 36 people in Loretta Carter's dining room that Thanksgiving, and every single one of them had watched it happen. The casserole had been hot, fresh from the oven, sweet potatoes still bubbling under a crust of brown sugar and butter. The kind of heat that doesn't just burn the skin, it burns through the memory and stays there. And Adana had felt every degree of it sliding down the side of her face, pooling along her collarbone, soaking into the white blouse she'd ironed that morning at 5 a.m. before anyone in the house was awake. The woman who poured it, Shayla, didn't apologize. She didn't even pretend it was an accident. She just set the empty casserole dish on the table like she'd finished serving and looked at Vince. Looked at him the way a woman looks at a man when she's already been told the house is hers. That look had comfort in it. Ownership. A smirk pressed into the corner of her glossed lips. Vince didn't flinch. He sat at the head of the table, the seat Adana had set for him that morning, with his elbows wide and his jaw tight. When their 12-year-old daughter, Tiana, reached across the table for a cloth napkin, Vince grabbed it first, snatched it mid-reach like he was taking something that belonged to him. He tossed it behind his chair and looked at Adana with flat, public cruelty. "You've been making a mess of this family for years," he said. Not quiet, not under his breath. He said it with the volume of a man who wanted every cousin, uncle, and auntie in that room to hear. "Clean yourself up somewhere else. You're embarrassing me." Tiana's hand was still in the air where the napkin used to be. 4-year-old Eli was in a booster seat 3 chairs down, screaming, not because he understood what was happening, but because his mother's face was covered in something hot and no one was helping her. Loretta, Vince's mother, sat at the other end of the table. She watched the whole thing. She saw the casserole hit Adana's head. She saw Shayla smile. She saw her own granddaughter reach for a napkin and get denied. And she looked down at her plate, picked up her fork, and said nothing. The whole room waited for Adana to scream, to cry, to flip the table or throw a plate or storm out the front door and slam it hard enough to crack the frame. That's what everyone was bracing for. The eruption, the meltdown, the scene that Vince could later describe to people as proof that she was unstable. But Adana didn't scream. She didn't cry. She sat perfectly still with hot food dripping from her hair onto her chest and let the room stare. Then she raised one hand slowly, wiped the casserole from her left eyebrow with the heel of her palm, and looked, not at Vince, not at Shayla, but at the center of the table, at the brass serving spoon sitting right next to the cranberry sauce. Her grandmother's spoon. The one Grandma Odie had given her on her wedding day, pressing it into her hand and saying, "Feed your family with love, baby, and the table will never be empty." Shayla had used that spoon to serve the greens 20 minutes ago, picked it up like it was hers, served food in Adana's house with Adana's grandmother's spoon while Adana sat 3 feet away. Adana looked at the spoon, then she looked at the purse sitting in her lap, and something passed across her face that no one in that room could name. Not anger, not sadness. Something quieter, something that made Loretta stop chewing and Vince shift in his seat. Because what nobody at that table understood yet was that Adana had known about all of it for 19 days. And she hadn't spent those 19 days crying. She'd spent them preparing. They met at a cookout 5 years earlier. The kind of summer block party where the smoke from the grill drifts over the whole street and somebody's uncle is playing Maze featuring Frankie Beverly from a speaker in the trunk of his car. Vince was charming back then. Not flashy, Not loud. Just a man with a firm handshake and a landscaping truck that he'd paid off himself. He told Adana he liked her laugh. She told him she liked a man who worked with his hands. Within a year, they were married. Small ceremony. Big love. They moved into a 2-bedroom apartment near the highway, and Vince started Carter Landscaping out of their garage with 3 employees and a notebook full of bids. Adana was working double shifts as a registered nurse at Mercy General. She came home at midnight most nights smelling like antiseptic and still found the energy to help Vince with his books. She co-signed the business loan, $22,000. Her credit, her signature. She didn't hesitate because she believed in him and because that's what you do when you're building something together. She reviewed the contracts. She kept the spreadsheets. On Saturdays, she made sandwiches for his crew because she knew a Fed team worked harder. And the business grew. Carter Landscaping went from 3 employees to 11, from residential yards to commercial contracts. They moved out of the apartment and into a 3-bedroom house with a real dining room and a backyard that Vince designed himself. Adana hung her grandmother's brass spoon on a hook in the kitchen the day they moved in. It caught the morning light every day like a small piece of gold. Then the shifts started happening. Not overnight, nothing that dramatic. Just slow turns. Vince started buying clothes Adana had never seen him wear before. He changed his cologne. He put a password on his phone and said it was for business security. He started coming home later, not by hours, but by 45 minutes here, an hour there, just enough to notice, but not enough to fight about. Loretta started visiting more often. Not the casual drop-ins she used to make with a pie or a casserole. These visits had an edge to them, a purpose. She'd sit in the kitchen with Vince while Adana was on shift, and when Adana came home, there was always a comment waiting for her like a note left on the counter. A man who provides doesn't need a woman questioning every dollar. Or, you're always working, Adana. A home needs a woman in it. Or the one that stayed with Adana the longest. My son used to smile more. I'm just saying what I see. The comments were soft, almost caring, wrapped in the voice of a concerned mother. But they always landed on the same bruise, the suggestion that Adana was somehow not enough. Then came the name. Shayla. Vince mentioned her casually one evening. Shayla from the office helped me with the bid proposal. Adana noticed, not the name itself, but the way Vince said it. Light. Too light. Like he'd practiced saying it out loud to make it sound like nothing. A few weeks later, Adana found a receipt in his jacket pocket. A jewelry store. A gold bracelet. $460. She opened her own jewelry box. Nothing new inside. She folded the receipt carefully, put it in the kitchen junk drawer behind the batteries, and said nothing. And then the name Shayla stopped appearing in conversation entirely. Vince never mentioned her again, and in the silence where her name used to be, Adana heard everything. 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, a Tuesday night, Eli was sitting on the couch playing a matching game on Vince's tablet, the one Vince had left on the kitchen counter before heading out for what he called a late client walk-through. Adana was folding laundry in the next room when she heard the tablet chime. Not a game sound. A message notification. She walked over and looked down at the screen over Eli's shoulder. The message was from Shayla. Your mama already said I can come for Thanksgiving. Tell your wife or don't. I don't care anymore. Adana didn't pick up the tablet immediately. She stood behind the couch for a full 10 seconds, her fingers pressed into the back cushion hard enough to leave dents in the fabric. Then she lifted it gently out of Eli's hands, handed him a stuffed animal, and sat down at the kitchen table. She opened the message thread. It went back 14 months. 14 months of messages, photos, inside jokes and plans. Vince had told Shayla he was leaving Adana after the holidays. He'd told her the house would be hers. He'd told her Adana was boring and predictable. He'd said in one message that Adana read 3 times with her jaw locked shut. She doesn't even know how boring she is. I need a woman who actually makes me feel alive. Adana's hand trembled once, just once. Then it stopped. She scrolled further, and that's when the second wound opened. The one she wasn't expecting, the one that went deeper than anything Vince could have done alone. Because it wasn't just Vince. Loretta was woven through the entire thread. Shayla had texted Vince. "Your mom took me furniture shopping today. She said the living room needs new curtains once I move in." And Vince had replied with a laughing emoji and the words, "She's already planning the housewarming." There were more. Loretta had taken Shayla to lunch twice. She'd told Shayla, according to Shayla's own words in the thread, "You're the kind of woman my son deserves. Someone who knows how to let a man be a man." Adana read that sentence sitting in the kitchen of the house she'd cleaned, the house she'd helped pay for, the house where Loretta had eaten meals Adana cooked and never once said thank you. Adana set the tablet down on the kitchen table and pressed both palms flat against the wood. She could feel the grain under her fingertips, the same table where she'd fed Tiana her first solid food, where she'd stayed up until 2 a.m., balancing Vince's books during tax season, where she'd rolled out pie crust for Loretta's birthday 3 years in a row. Every good thing she'd ever done for this family had happened at this table, and now she was sitting at it, reading about her own replacement. She didn't cry. She didn't call her sister. She didn't pack a bag or throw his clothes on the lawn. She sat at that kitchen table for 45 minutes with her hands folded in front of her like she was praying. But she wasn't praying. She was thinking, the kind of thinking that doesn't move fast, the kind that moves deep. Then she stood up, walked to the kitchen drawer, and pulled out the jewelry receipt she'd saved months ago. She took a photo of it with her phone. She screenshotted every message on the tablet, Shayla's, Vince's, and every mention of Loretta. She saved them all to a folder she labeled Recipes. And then she did something that no one would have expected. She picked up the house phone and started calling every member of the Carter family. Every single one. Aunts, uncles, cousins. Vince's brother in Charlotte. Pastor Bernard. Vince's uncle on his father's side. The man the whole family trusted to tell the truth even when the truth was heavy. Helen, Loretta's own sister. She called them all with warmth and insistence. "I want everyone together this Thanksgiving," she said. "The whole family. It's important to me." Every single person said yes. The next morning, before her shift, Adana drove to the county courthouse. She parked in the back lot where the trees were bare, walked inside with a manila folder under her arm, and filed paperwork with the clerk's office. The clerk stamped the documents and slid them back across the counter. Adana placed them inside the folder, tucked the folder into her purse, and walked back to her car, without saying a word to anyone. What she filed that morning would remain sealed for exactly 19 days. Adana moved through those 19 days like a woman walking on the surface of a lake. Steady, deliberate, and so calm that the water didn't ripple. She met with a divorce attorney named Gail Okonkwo during her lunch breaks twice that week. She brought everything, the tablet screenshots, the text thread printouts, the bracelet receipt photo, and the co-signed loan documents for Carter Landscaping. Gail looked at the paperwork, looked at Adana across the desk, and said, "You built half of this business. You'll leave with half of it, at minimum." Adana nodded. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She put the folder back in her bag and asked, "How soon can we move once I'm ready?" "The day you say go," Gail told her. "I'll be waiting." Adana started recording conversations. Not every day, just the ones that mattered. She recorded Vince standing in the kitchen one evening, leaning against the counter with a beer in his hand, telling her with casual contempt, "You should be grateful I still come home at night." Most men wouldn't. She kept her face perfectly neutral while the phone in her apron pocket captured every syllable. She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She just poured Eli a glass of juice and said, "I know." 2 days later, she recorded a phone call with Loretta. It was a Sunday afternoon and Loretta called to talk about Thanksgiving logistics. How many chairs they'd need, what time people were arriving. And then, almost casually, like she was commenting on the weather, Loretta said, "Adana, if my son finds happiness elsewhere, a good wife would step aside gracefully. I'm not saying anything is happening, I'm just saying." Adana thanked her for the advice and ended the call. Then she sat on the edge of her bed and played the recording back twice to make sure every word was captured. She stored the recordings on a flash drive and kept it inside a zipped pocket of her purse. She bought a small Bluetooth speaker from the electronics section at Target, the kind that fits in the palm of a hand but projects sound clear enough to fill a room. She tested it one night in the bathroom with the door locked, playing Vince's voice back to herself. "You should be grateful I still come home at night." The audio was crisp, every word sharp enough to cut glass. During those 3 weeks, Adana didn't change her behavior. That was the most remarkable part. She cooked dinner. She asked Vince about his day. She complimented his new shirt. She laughed at Loretta's jokes on Sunday phone calls. She tucked Eli in at night and helped Tiana with her book report on Frederick Douglass. She was the same Adana, the same steady, warm, present woman she had always been. And that calm was what started to unsettle Vince. Not a lot. Just enough. He mentioned it to Shayla in a text Adana never saw but didn't need to. "She's being weird, too nice, like she's not even mad about anything." Shayla replied, "Maybe she's just stupid, baby. Don't overthink it." But Vince couldn't shake it. Something about the way Adana looked at him over dinner. Not angry, not sad, just steady. Like she was watching him from a place he couldn't reach. It made him eat faster. It made him leave the room first. He didn't know why. The weekend before Thanksgiving, Adana began preparing the menu. She planned every dish herself. The turkey, the mac and cheese, the sweet potato casserole, the greens, the cornbread, the peach cobbler. She wrote the menu on a notepad in the kitchen, the same way she did every year, and at the bottom of the list, in handwriting only she would understand, she wrote 2 words: "Dessert last." She called Pastor Bernard one more time that week. "Uncle Bernard," she said softly, "I need you at that table. Promise me you'll come." He promised. Something in her voice made him promise fast. And through all of this, through the legal filings and the recordings and the quiet planning, Vince grew more confident. He told Shayla to buy a new dress for Thanksgiving. He told his mother to make room at the table. He said to Adana, casually, 2 days before the holiday, "I might bring a friend from work to dinner. That okay?" And Adana looked at him with the same calm she'd been wearing like armor for 19 days and said, "Of course, the more the merrier." Vince smiled. He thought he was winning. He thought he was the one with the plan. He had no idea that every chair at that table had already been assigned, and the woman he called boring had already written the last act of a story. He didn't know he was inside. Thanksgiving morning came cold and sharp, the kind of November air that makes your lungs feel tight the second you step outside. Adana was up before dawn. She moved through the kitchen in bare feet and a head wrap, pulling out pots and pans, seasoning the turkey, setting timers. The house smelled like butter and cinnamon and sage by 7 a.m. She set the dining table herself. 36 place settings. Real plates, the wedding china, still in the original boxes until today. She placed the brass serving spoon at the center of the table, right between the salt and pepper shakers. She stood back and looked at it for a long moment, her hand resting on the back of a chair. Then she touched the handle of the spoon with one finger, like she was saying goodbye to something. By noon, the house was full. Cousins carried foil-covered dishes through the front door. Kids ran through the hallway. Someone plugged in a speaker and played gospel music low enough to hum under the conversation. Pastor Bernard arrived with Helen, both of them hugging Adana in the doorway. Adana held Bernard's hand a beat longer than usual. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. He nodded without asking why. Vince pulled into the driveway at 1:15. He stepped out of his truck in a pressed shirt and new shoes. Shoes Adana had never seen before, the kind a man buys when he's dressing for someone new. Shayla stepped out of the passenger side in a red wrap dress, her hair freshly done, gold hoops swinging, and her wrist catching the light from a bracelet. $460 of light. She adjusted the bracelet as she walked up the driveway, rotating it so the clasp faced down, like a woman who wanted people to notice it but couldn't quite commit to showing it off. They walked in together. The front room conversations didn't stop, but they slowed. A few cousins exchanged glances across the room. Vince's brother from Charlotte leaned back in his chair and looked at his wife with raised eyebrows. But nobody said anything. Not yet. Loretta appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. She crossed the room and hugged Shayla warmly. Warmly enough for everyone to see. She walked Shayla into the dining room like she was introducing a guest of honor, pulling out a chair for her at the table. Not any chair. The chair next to Vince's seat. The chair where Adana had been sitting 20 minutes earlier, setting the napkins. Adana saw all of it. She was leaning against the kitchen door frame, holding a glass of sweet tea, watching the room rearrange itself around a woman she'd never been formally introduced to, but whose furniture preferences she could now describe from memory. She took a slow sip. She didn't react. During the appetizer hour, Shayla moved through the room with the kind of comfort that said she'd been coached. She touched Vince's arm when she talked. She called him baby in front of his Aunt Helen, who looked at Adana across the room with concern that Adana answered with a slight nod that said, "I know." Shayla offered to carry dishes to the table, and when she passed through the kitchen, she picked up Adana's brass serving spoon without asking and used it to scoop collard greens into a serving bowl. She held it like it was hers, like everything in this house already belonged to her. Adana watched the spoon leave its place. Her jaw tightened once. She said nothing. Adana's cousin Rena pulled her into the hallway near the bathroom. "Girl, what's happening right now?" Rena whispered, her hand gripping Adana's arm. "Why are you letting this woman walk through your house like she pays the mortgage?" Adana looked at Rena with eyes that were steady and dry and full of something Rena couldn't read. She squeezed Rena's hand and said, "Because some tables need to be set before they can be flipped." Rena searched Adana's face for a crack, for tears, for rage, for something familiar. She found nothing but calm. She didn't ask again. At the table, just before the main course was served, Vince leaned back in his chair with an ease that made something in the room shift. He looked comfortable, settled, like a man who'd already decided the outcome of the evening and was just waiting for everyone else to catch up. He glanced at Adana once. A quick, dismissive sweep of the eyes, the kind of look you give furniture, and then turned to Shayla and whispered something that made her laugh. A quiet, possessive laugh. The kind that said, "We're the main characters here." And that was when Shayla stood up, reached for the casserole dish that Adana had spent 40 minutes preparing that morning, walked behind Adana's chair, and tilted the dish. The sweet potato casserole, hot, heavy, and thick with brown sugar, slid out and landed on Adana's head. The table erupted. Eli screamed from his booster seat. Tiana lunged for a napkin. Vince snatched it from her hand and tossed it on the floor, and Adana sat still. The room held its breath, 36 people frozen in a Thanksgiving snapshot that none of them would ever forget. The only sound was Eli's crying, sharp and frightened from across the table, and the slow drip of casserole falling from Adana's chin onto the white tablecloth. Adana sat in it. She let the moment exist. She let the heat soak through her scalp and the sugar crust settle into her braids and the humiliation press itself into the memory of every person watching. She let every person in that room see exactly what her marriage had become. A woman covered in food at her own table in her own house, while her husband's mistress stood behind her, smiling, and then, without hurrying, she wiped her face with the heel of her palm. Not panicked, not broken, just clearing the view. She reached into her purse. She didn't pull out her phone. She pulled out the small black Bluetooth speaker. She set it on the table gently, right next to the brass serving spoon. Nobody moved. Nobody understood. Not yet. Adana pressed a button, and Vince's own voice filled the dining room. Clear, undeniable, and recorded in the very kitchen visible through the doorway to her left. "You should be grateful I still come home at night. Most men wouldn't." The room stopped. Completely stopped. Vince's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His brother from Charlotte dropped his fork. Pastor Bernard set down his glass slowly and turned to face Vince with an expression that made the air feel heavier. Helen's hand went to her chest. Loretta's eyes widened. Not at the words, but at the fact that they'd been captured. Adana didn't pause. She pressed the next track. Loretta's voice now, sugar-coated and certain and unmistakable. "If my son finds happiness elsewhere, a good wife would step aside gracefully." A sound moved through the room. Not a gasp, but a collective inhale. Loretta's face drained of color like someone had pulled a plug. She looked around the table for an ally, for a sympathetic face, for anyone who might defend her. She found none. Helen, her own sister, the woman who'd known her for 62 years, stared at her across the table like she was seeing someone she'd never met before. Third track, Vince's voice again, but different this time. Softer, warmer, tender in a way Adana hadn't heard directed at her in over a year. The voice he saved for Shayla. "After Thanksgiving, the house is yours. I already told my lawyer to start the papers. Just be patient, baby. It's almost done." Shayla's smile collapsed. Not slowly. It broke like a plate hitting a tile floor. She stepped backward from the table, and the gold bracelet on her wrist caught the overhead light one final time. The silence that followed was the loudest thing that had ever happened in that house. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware of your own breathing. Not even Eli was crying anymore. He was just watching his mother, wide-eyed, his small hands gripping the edge of his booster seat. Adana stood up, slowly, with the kind of deliberate calm that made every person in the room hold still. Casserole still clinging to her braids, staining her white blouse in uneven streaks of brown, drying on her neck in a pattern that looked like a map of everything she'd endured. She reached across the table and picked up the brass serving spoon, her grandmother's spoon. The one Shayla had used an hour ago to serve food in Adana's home like she already lived there. Adana held it gently, not like a weapon, like an heirloom, like something she was taking back. "My grandmother gave me this spoon on my wedding day," she said. Her voice was steady, not loud, not shaking, not begging for pity or looking for applause. Just clear. She told me, "Feed your family with love and the table will never be empty." I did that. For 5 years. I co-signed the business loan. I kept the books. I fed his crew on Saturdays. I fed this family every holiday. I put food on this exact table. She looked at the spoon in her hand. And this is what my table got back. She set the spoon down. Then she reached into her purse again and pulled out a manila folder. She opened it and spread 3 documents across the table like cards in a hand she'd been holding for 19 days. The first, the divorce filing, stamped by the county courthouse, dated 19 days ago. The open loop, what she'd filed that quiet morning before her shift, now closed in front of 36 witnesses. The second, the co-signed loan agreement for Carter Landscaping, showing Adana's name, Adana's credit score, Adana's signature on the dotted line that built the business Vince now acted like he'd created alone. The third, a jewelry store receipt. $460. One gold bracelet. She slid it across the table toward Shayla without looking at her. "He bought you that bracelet with money from a business I built," Adana said. "You can keep it. Consider it severance." Shayla didn't touch the receipt. She stood frozen with one hand still resting on the back of Vince's chair, like she'd forgotten how to let go of something that was never hers. Pastor Bernard pushed back from the table and stood. The room shifted toward him the way a room always shifts toward the person everyone trusts to say what needs to be said. He looked at Vince. Not with rage, not with disgust, with something heavier than both. The kind of disappointment that comes from someone who loved you first and watched you become someone they don't recognize. "You brought this woman into your wife's house," Bernard said slowly. "On a day your wife spent cooking for your family. You let hot food be poured on her head. You snatched a towel out of your own daughter's hand while your 4-year-old son sat there screaming. And you told her to clean herself up." He paused. The pause lasted 3 seconds. It felt like 30. "I've preached for 31 years. I don't have a sermon for this. I just have shame." Vince opened his mouth. "Uncle Bernard, you don't understand the whole..." "Boy." Bernard didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The word landed like a hand on a table. "Every person at this table understands. That is your problem." Loretta tried next. She leaned forward, her hands flat on the tablecloth, reaching toward Bernard like she could pull him back to her side. "Now, Bernard, Vince is my son, and I have a right to support." Helen turned her chair, physically rotated it so that her back was facing her sister. She didn't say a word. The chair said it all. 62 years of sisterhood, and Helen had just turned her back on Loretta in front of the entire family. Loretta's mouth closed. Her hands slid off the table into her lap. Adana bent down, lifted Eli from his booster seat. He wrapped his arms around her neck and buried his face in her shoulder, pressing against the sticky residue of sweet potato casserole that still clung to her collar. She took Tiana's hand with her free hand. Tiana squeezed hard, the kind of grip that says, "I'm here," without needing words. She walked toward the front door. She didn't slam it. She didn't look back. She didn't say goodbye to anyone at that table because she had already said everything that needed to be said. The front door clicked shut behind her, with a sound so quiet it made the silence inside louder than anything anyone at that table had ever heard. 36 people sat in front of cold food, 3 recordings still hanging in the air, and a brass serving spoon resting at the center of the table like the last word in an argument that was finally over. Vince called Adana 47 times in the 3 days after Thanksgiving. She didn't answer once. Not out of anger, not out of pettiness. She simply had nothing left to say to him, and silence was the only language he hadn't learned how to argue with. The family fractured within a week. The group text, the one Loretta had managed for years like a social chairman, organizing birthdays and Sunday dinners and holiday rotations, went quiet first, then erupted. Pastor Bernard sent one message. "I sat at that table and watched a man destroy his own home with his bare hands. I won't sit in silence about it." Half the family responded with agreement. The other half said nothing, and their silence said enough. Vince showed up at Adana's new apartment twice. The first time, she let him stand in the doorway. He started with excuses. It wasn't what it looked like. Shayla meant nothing. He was confused. The pressure of the business had gotten to him. Adana listened for about 20 seconds, her arms crossed, her face still. Then she said, "You told me to clean food off my own head in front of your daughter. You took a towel out of your child's hand. We don't have a conversation left." She closed the door while he was still forming his next sentence. The second time he came, she didn't open the door at all. He knocked for 6 minutes. She sat on the couch with Eli on her lap, reading him a picture book about a bear who builds his own cave, and didn't look up once. Tiana sat across from them with her headphones in, pretending to do homework, but her eyes were on her mother, studying the stillness, learning what it looked like when a woman chose peace over performance. Carter Landscaping started bleeding. Not all at once. Slowly, the way a tire loses air from a nail you didn't notice. 3 of Vince's biggest commercial contracts, the ones that paid the bills, the ones that funded the new truck and the new shoes and the gold bracelet, had originally come through referrals from Adana's nursing network, the hospital administrator whose property Vince maintained, the church facilities director who'd hired him for the grounds, the property manager at the senior care campus where Adana had worked weekends for 2 years. Within 2 weeks, all 3 contracts were under review. Within a month, 2 were gone. Nobody sent Vince an angry letter. Nobody confronted him. They just stopped calling. And the silence of a phone that doesn't ring is its own kind of punishment. Loretta tried to repair what she'd broken. She drove to Adana's apartment on a Sunday afternoon, dressed up in her church clothes, carrying a sweet potato pie she'd baked that morning, the same recipe, the same dish. Whether she intended the irony or not, it arrived with her. Adana answered the door in sweatpants and a head wrap. She looked at the pie. She looked at Loretta. "You helped another woman pick out furniture for my house," Adana said. Her voice was even. No venom, no drama, just truth delivered the way you'd read a receipt. "You took her to lunch while I was washing your son's clothes and feeding your grandchildren. You told her she was the kind of woman your son deserved." Loretta opened her mouth. She had something prepared. Adana could see it sitting behind her lips, a rehearsed apology or explanation or deflection. But Adana didn't give it room. "We're done, Loretta." The door closed. The pie sat on the welcome mat for 2 hours before Loretta came back, picked it up with both hands, and carried it to her car without looking back at the building. Shayla lasted 5 weeks. 5 weeks of watching the business contracts disappear like lights going off in a building. 5 weeks of Vince coming home angry instead of charming, defeated instead of confident, pacing the living room at midnight blaming everyone but himself. 5 weeks of realizing that the house she'd been promised was tied up in divorce proceedings and the lifestyle she'd been sold was built on a co-signed loan from the woman whose head she'd poured food on in front of 36 witnesses. She packed a bag on a Wednesday evening while Vince was at a meeting he'd scheduled to try to save a contract he'd already lost. She didn't leave a note. She didn't explain. She just folded her things into a duffel bag, took one last look around the living room, the room where Loretta had promised her new curtains, and walked out the back door. She left her key on the kitchen counter, next to a coffee mug she'd bought for the apartment she thought would be hers. By the time she merged onto the highway, Vince's number was blocked and his name was already becoming something she'd rather forget. Vince came home to an empty house that night. He called Shayla's name from the front door, then again from the hallway, then once more from the bedroom, quieter, like a man who already knows the answer but asks the question anyway because the silence is worse. He walked through every room like a man checking locks on a house he's already lost. The dining room still had the table where Thanksgiving had happened. The tablecloth had been changed, but the memory hadn't. It sat in the wood like a stain you can cover but never remove. The hook in the kitchen where the brass serving spoon used to hang was empty. Adana had taken it with her. Vince stood in front of that bare hook for a long time, his hands at his sides, staring at a nail that held nothing. 6 months passed. Spring turned the trees along Adana's street bright green, and the light came through her apartment windows in long golden strips every morning. She'd moved into a 2-bedroom off Maple Avenue. Nothing fancy, but clean and warm and hers. The rent came from her nursing salary, and the settlement from the business buyout sat in a savings account she checked once a month and smiled at. She'd enrolled in a nurse practitioner program at the community college across town. Classes on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Tiana helped quiz her with flashcards at the kitchen table while Eli sat on the floor stacking wooden blocks into structures he insisted were hospitals. Adana drove a used Honda Civic she'd bought with cash. It had a scratch on the rear bumper and a rearview mirror that vibrated slightly on the highway. It was modest, and it was entirely hers. The brass serving spoon sat in a ceramic holder on the kitchen counter, right next to the stove. It caught the morning light the same way it had in the old house. But different now. It wasn't hanging on someone else's wall anymore. It was standing upright in a kitchen that belonged to the woman it was given to. On a Saturday evening in late April, Adana made spaghetti for dinner. Nothing fancy, nothing that required a recipe or a special trip to the store. Eli sat on the counter, handing her garlic cloves one at a time with the seriousness of a surgeon passing instruments. He counted each one out loud. 1, 2, 3. And Adana corrected him gently every time. 3, baby. He grinned and said, "Free" again, and she kissed his forehead and let it go. Tiana was at the table doing homework, her pencil tapping against her textbook in a rhythm that matched the music playing softly from a speaker on the windowsill. Every few minutes, she'd look up and ask a vocabulary question, and Adana would answer without turning from the stove. Her voice warm and automatic, the way a mother sounds when she's fully present in a room that belongs to her. The kitchen was small, the music was low, the laughter was easy. And across town on that same Saturday evening, Vince drove past Adana's apartment complex. He didn't plan to. Or maybe he did. Maybe he'd been driving past for weeks, slowing at the same spot, looking for the same window. He pulled to the curb near the building and looked up at the second floor. Through the thin curtain, he could see the warm yellow light of the kitchen. He could see movement, shadows of people he used to live with, doing something as simple as making dinner together, something he'd had and thrown away like it cost nothing. He parked. He sat in his truck for 5 minutes with the engine idling. He didn't call. He didn't get out. He just watched the window and the light and the moving shadows, and whatever he felt sitting in that truck, regret, loss, recognition, it stayed with him in the cab like a passenger he couldn't drop off. Then he put the truck in drive and pulled away from the curb. The window got smaller in his side mirror until it disappeared. Inside the apartment, Adana washed the brass spoon after dinner. She dried it slowly with a dish towel, turning it over in her hands the way her grandmother used to. Carefully, like it was worth more than what it was made of. She set it back in the ceramic holder, touched it once with her fingertip, and whispered, "Thank you, Grandma." She didn't win because she fought harder. She won because she remembered that some tables aren't worth sitting at, and the bravest thing a woman can do is build her own. If you've ever watched someone stay calm when the whole room expected them to break, then you know exactly what kind of strength that takes. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss the next one.